So you're going to make a box and multiply this out. So multiply the x plus 7 times x minus 1, sorry. And then on this other side where it says x plus 1 squared, that means you have to multiply x plus 1 times x plus 1. So go ahead, take about 60 seconds to do that. Okay. So when you multiply this side, this is what you should get. Combine your like terms. 7x minus x is 6x. So you should have x squared plus 6x minus 7. And then on the other side, x plus 1 times x plus 1, you should have x squared plus 2x plus 1. Who had that? So what's going to happen when you subtract x squared from both sides? I know it's early, y'all, but we got 80-some more days. Well, you cannot square root it. That's why I put you have to multiply first. Now, if it was two exponents on both sides, then you could square root it. But you have to multiply first. That would be your first step.
No, I thought like when you have an x on both x squared on both sides.
Oh, okay. So you can't square root it because you would have to take the square root of every term, okay? And that would be very, very hard. So you can't take the square root, like these are not perfect squares. So you would just solve it. So when you subtract the x squared from both sides, it cancels out. So this is actually a very basic equation. So just go ahead and solve that. So I'm going to subtract the 2x, which is 4x minus 7 equals 1. And then I'm going to add 7. So that's 4x equals 8. So what does x equal? Who had x equals 2? Okay. So yesterday we ended off with a factor by grouping question. We're going to continue that. So our last example for factoring is factor by grouping. So we're on question G. So I'll give you a second to copy it down. You want to put the first two in a group, and then the second two go in a group. And you're taking out the GCF of the group. So what's the greatest common factor in this red group? What do they both have that I can take out? X squared. So let's take out the x squared. This is a test question. Last year, this is the one, the factor by grouping, this is the one that they missed the most. So when you take out the x squared, you're dividing them by x squared. So after I divide both of those terms by the GCF, what do I have left? So 3x cubed divided by x squared, you're going to subtract your exponents, and that gives you just 3x. And then x squared divided by x squared is just 1. So you should have 3x plus 4. So you have to figure out, what do you need to take out of this second group? What do you think I'm taking out of this second group in order to have 3x plus 4 again? Not 9, but negative 9. So take out a negative 9. So you're dividing both of these by negative 9. And again, you get 3x plus 4. So this is only one group. That's one factor. So 3x plus 4 is one factor. And then my second factor is what I took out. So I took out an x squared, and I took out a negative 9. So those two come together to create the second factor. So 3x plus 4, and then x squared minus 9. X squared minus 9 can be factored down again to the difference of squares. So that factors down to x plus 3 and x minus 3. And then you have 3x plus 4. Go ahead and set all three of these factors equal to 0 to get your three solutions. So your first one is a fraction and the other two are not. So you should get, your first solution should be x equals negative 4/3. And then you should have x equals positive and negative 3. And you can write it like that also. You don't have to write it as two answers. So you can, but that's not necessary. And those represent your three solutions. Any questions about how we did that? Okay. So let's go ahead and look at our next example. We're going to talk about the quadratic formula. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at this real quick. You don't have to write down this whole slide. The main thing that you might want to write down is this is the part that's important. So, I guess you do need to write it down, so I'll give you a minute. Go ahead and write it down. So while you're writing, I'll go ahead and explain it. What this is saying is, in your homework, there's some questions where it just asks you to do a discriminant test. So in order to do a discriminant test, that means you're only doing b squared minus 4ac. So if you have b squared minus 4ac, and that number is greater than 0, then that means you have two solutions, two different solutions. If you do b squared minus 4ac and you get 0, then you only have one solution. one real solution. But if it's negative, you have no real solutions. And I'm going to actually annotate on here a little bit. Hold on. So basically, if this number is positive, then you have a parabola that's going to cross through twice. If you get 0, it's only going to touch down once. But if it's negative, it's not going to touch the x-axis at all. All right, so I'll give you a second to copy that down, and then we'll do some quadratic formula. And we're going to solve it using the quadratic formula. Now, just like with factoring, you want to make sure it's set equal to 0 first. So this one is set equal to 0. So A is 1, B is -4, and C is +2. So we're going to actually start. Now, the way I like to do the quadratic formula is I always start with the discriminant. So the first thing I want you to do is find B squared minus 4AC. And I want to caution you that when you type this in your calculator, anytime you square a negative, you have to put it in parentheses. So if you type it in your calculator like this, that's wrong. You cannot put a negative in your calculator and try to square it unless you put parentheses around it. This is going to give you the wrong answer. Okay? There should be calculators spread around the room. Go ahead and type that in. If you don't have, feel free to borrow a calculator. Type in your discriminant. And I believe you get 12. Nope, that doesn't sound right. 16 minus 8. 8. Did you get 8? I'm not using a calculator, so. Yeah. Okay, thank you. I'll give you all a chance to make sure that's what you get. All right, so you have 8, and that 8 is underneath the square root. So you have to simplify 8. So what's the largest perfect square that goes into 8? What does 8 break down to? 4 times what is 8? So we're going to break that 8 down to 4 times 2, which is just going to become 2 root 2. So this is going to break down to 4 times 2. And then the square root of 4 is 2. So this is what your discriminant is. This is what you're going to actually put into the quadratic formula. I'm trying to use the highlight. There we go. All right, so now you're ready to do the rest. So your solution is x equals, and then it's the opposite of b. So b is -4. What's the opposite of -4? +4, plus or minus, and then you type in, you write your discriminant. And that's all over 2 times 1, which is 2. And that is your solution. Okay, so does anybody know what else we can do here? For my seniors that's going off to somebody's college next year. This will not be okay. There is one more thing that you should do to get full credit to this answer. It can be reduced. Divide by 2. Exactly. Now, I want to make sure you understand what you can divide by 2. You cannot touch that. You cannot touch the 2 underneath the square root. Okay, but I like to call it the triangle test. You look at these 3 numbers to see if there's a number that you can divide these by. Everything except this. This cannot be touched. So all of these numbers can be divided by 2, so let's divide it by 2. So your best answer, the answer that would give you full credit, and I would only take off a half a point if you didn't reduce it on your test on the 19th. I wouldn't mark the whole thing wrong, but I would take off something. But the best answer would be x equals, and then it would be 2 plus or minus root 2. And that would be your final answer. Now you can put the 1 in your denominator, but you don't have to. This is your final answer. Okay, I need to make that so that it's not... trying to do that. Okay. That is the final answer. All right, go ahead and find your discriminant for part B. We're only doing 2 questions on the quadratic formula. Now, because we had an 8, notice that when we did this, we got 8. I knew we have 2 answers. Okay, 2 real answers. Do it again. Did you use this negative? Hold on. I think it's because you used the negative instead of a subtraction. That should be a subtraction. So this is the negative and that's subtraction. Okay. All right, so A is 4. B is, what's B? -1. C is 2. So go ahead and type this in. B squared minus 4 times A times C. Wait, what'd you say, Nish?
I didn't know that you had to switch it to negative, but I didn't see that negative in front of it.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah. It's early and this is first period and I only do this one time. So if you think like, wait a minute, you messed up, I might have messed up. So let's make sure, you know. Okay, so type that in your calculator. Let me see if I can do this without a calculator. Okay, so 16 times 2 is 32. So I think you get -31. But again, I'm not using the calculator. So because we get a negative, what does that mean? How many solutions do we have? How many real solutions do we have when you get a negative? 0. So this is not gonna, this parabola will not touch down to the x-axis. It's going to be above the x-axis. So there are no real roots. Okay, so now we have to take the square root of -31. And whenever you have a negative underneath the square root, we have to take that out. You cannot leave a negative underneath the square root. Does anybody remember what the square root of -1 is? It's a letter. It's I, because it's imaginary. So this is what you're going to put into the quadratic formula. So you have I in front, and then you have root 31. So your solution is x equals the opposite of b. So b is negative. So when I use it in my formula, it's going to become positive. So it's 1 plus or minus, and then you have I, root 31, and that's all over 2 times a. And if a is 4, that means it's 2 times 4. And what is 2 times 4? 8. And that would be your final answer. When you do your triangle test, you can't reduce anything because you have a 1, a 1, and an 8. So that can't be simplified. So that's the quadratic formula. And the last method we're going to learn, there's 3 methods to solve a quadratic. Factoring, quadratic formula, and what was the third one? It was what you wrote in your notes yesterday, the first thing. The 3 ways to solve a quadratic. Factoring, quadratic formula, and now we're going to do completing the square. Okay? So we're going to start it. So after today, technically you should be able to do all of that first homework because I've covered it all. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's complete the square. Oops, wait, hold on. Those are the hard ones. I don't mean to go to that one. Okay, there we go. Let's do these 2 first. These are the easy ones. So completing the square. And only copy down 1. Don't copy them both because I think I'm going to try to give you some steps off to the side. So this is the new material if you did not take Honors Algebra 2, so this is going to be new. So I'm going to go through this one a little slower. Factoring, you should have all factored before and you've all seen the quadratic formula, but for some of you this is new, so I want to go over it and give you the steps off to the side. Okay, so your first step is going to be to move C. Okay, so what I mean by that is when you're doing completing the square, you want it to be set up so that you have your ax squared plus bx, and then it should equal C. So that constant needs to go across. This is the only method where it should not equal 0. If you're doing this method, you don't want it to equal 0. So what should I do in this example to move C? This needs to go across. So how do I do that? Add it. So let's do that first. So I want you to add 59 to both sides. And this is what you should get. Step 2 is to factor out A from A and B, or say from the left. Oops. Uh-oh. I don't know why. That says from. Okay. What is A in this equation? What is A? 1. So for these first 2 examples, these are the easy ones. We can really disregard step 2 because A is 1. So we don't have anything to factor out. Step 3 is to add b/2 squared to both sides. So what is b? What is my b? So divide that by 2. What do you get? What's half of negative 12? It's negative 6. And what's negative 6 squared? Positive or negative 36? Positive. It should always be positive. When you square any number, it's positive. So you need to add 36 to both sides. So let's do that. Step 4, factor the left. And when I factor it, when you factor this down, that should factor down to a perfect square. So what are my two numbers that multiply to 36 but add to negative 12? It's always going to be the same number. It's a perfect square. Because we chose a number intentionally to make it a perfect square. So what is this going to factor down to? Plus or minus 6? Minus. So this is going to factor down to x minus 6 times x minus 6. But in math, if we have the same thing twice, we write it as x minus 6 squared. So you have x minus 6 squared equals, go ahead and put this in your calculator to see what you get. So you get 100. Okay, so in the Bell work, we couldn't square both sides. We had to actually multiply it out. But this is different because we're trying to solve it. And we actually have, in this example, this whole thing, we only have one term and we have one term. So now we can take the square root. Because I'm taking the square root of the left and the square root of one thing. There's only one thing on the right. So we're going to take the square root of both sides. So that's step 5. Step 5 is going to be to take the square root. I'm going to have to erase the steps. So step 5 is to take the square root of both sides. And when I take the square root, because this whole thing, because I have parentheses and I have an exponent on the outside, the only thing that's going to do is get rid of my exponent. So it's just going to be x minus 6. And what is the square root of 10? That happens to be a perfect square. So what's the square root of 10? There's two answers. 10 and what else? Positive 10 and negative 10. Every square root has two answers. So this is actually going to be plus and minus 10. And then your last and final step is to separate and solve. So we have x minus 6 equals 10. Go ahead and solve that. And x minus 6 equals negative 10. Get your two solutions. So I'm always trying to go back to, the first test should be pretty easy. What are the things that is missed most often? And it would be the new material. So this is one of those questions. Because completing the square, is not used as often, but it is a skill that you need to know and understand. So my two solutions, when I add 6, you should get x equals 16. That's your first solution. And then on the other side, when I add 6, what do you get? X equals what? -4. All right, I want to do one more question. This one took a little longer because I wrote out the steps, but hopefully you have your 6 steps down so you can use that as a reference and we can get through this next one kind of fast. Any questions about that first example? All right, let's do it again. Copy down B. So what's my first step? What am I going to do first? Move C. So I'm going to move that 97. How do I move it? Subtract it. And hold on one second, y'all. I'm going to make sure. I think I forgot to change this example. One second. We're not going to do B. We're going to just go right to C. And then we'll end with C today. And this one is going to actually use all 6 steps because we have a 3. So this is probably good that we're doing this too. Okay, so your first step is going to be to subtract that 15, which is going to give you 3x squared minus 24x equals -15. Now, before you can complete the square, we have to take out that 3. Remember in that when you wrote down your steps, I said that didn't apply for that first example because A was 1. But now we have a number other than 1. So I want you to divide these 2 by 3. Just by 3. Divide these 2 by 3. So when I divide only these 2 by 3, I'm going to take that 3 out. And then left on the inside will be x squared minus 8x. I'm only taking the 3 out of these 2. I'm not touching that 15. That 15 is on the other side of the equal sign. So you're only taking the 3 out of these 2. Now you're going to complete the square. Step 3. So what does step 3 say? What do you have to do for step 3? Add b over 2 squared. And what is b? B, -8. So go ahead and take that -8, divide it by 2, and square it. So take -8 divided by 2, which is -4. And -4 squared is what? 16. But here's the thing that you have to keep in mind. I'm not really adding 16. I'm really adding 3 times 16, right? Because everything in this parentheses is multiplied by 3. So on this side, you need to multiply that 16 by 3. So this is really 3 times 16 on that side. Okay, so let's factor this down. That's going to factor down to a perfect square. What do you think that factors down to? Two numbers that multiply to be positive 16 and add to negative 8. So this is going to multiply down to x minus 4 squared. Go ahead and type this in your calculator, see what you get. Did you get 33? 33? All right, so now before I take the square root, I have to get rid of this 3. How do you think I'm going to do that? If this is being multiplied, what's the opposite of multiplication? So let's divide both sides by 3. We're almost to the finish line, y'all. And you get x minus 4 squared equals 11. Now we can get rid of this square, and the opposite would be to take the square root. So we have x minus 4 equals plus and minus the root 11. And because this is not a perfect square, we don't have to solve it. The only thing we need to do is move this 4 over. So my final answer is 4 plus or minus the square root of 11. And that would be it. Okay, so technically you should be able to do all of that first homework because we've covered everything. Passing out books tomorrow. I got to put these stickers on. But I already scanned the homework pages and emailed that to you guys in Canvas so you can get started. Homework 1 is due Monday.